Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen. Episode 35, The Interdependence of Thinking and Writing.
Okay, Eric, so in this episode, we're going to explore this idea of writing as a tool for thinking. We just had a really interesting off-air conversation about this, and I think there's a lot of levels that we can take this through, whether it's writing about how to get better as being a music teacher, whether you're a teacher or actually in some kind of academic situation, like trying to get your master's or your doctorate or even your bachelor's degree. I'm also thinking how this would relate to learning music as kind of yourself as a student, and also composing music. I think there's a lot of possibility to use writing to explore how you even approach composing your own music.
Or teaching. So you write things down to help improve, as you reflect on your teaching and doing that regularly. Maybe not right at the end of the school day, but some of the minutiae right at the end of the school day of thought you had that you want to get down, but also more globally about your approach to teaching. What writing might provide for you that wouldn't provide if you didn't do it, obviously. Mm-hmm. So reflecting on it, also maybe just writing down the stages of audiation without looking at the book, or it could be anything that you want to synthesize in your brain to make.
So I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to make you be more precise about how you're thinking about things, because writing provides that thinking, and then reflecting on what you've written helps improve your thinking, and thinking improves your writing. So it's a cycle.
There's a feedback loop.
It is like an oral loop. You need both.
The reason I think this is important to talk about is I think there's kind of like a pop psychology idea floating around out there that writing is the act of, whether it's on pen and paper or with a computer or a typewriter or whatever, putting in print ideas that you already have. But that makes it sound like the writing is a process you go through to basically just make physical the thoughts you already have. And I think that doesn't give full credit to the fact that, like you said, with this feedback loop of writing things down and reflecting on them, the writing of your ideas down actually changes the way that they're synthesized. And so it's not just like a writing your own ideas down or your thought processes down. It's not like a passive activity. It actually shapes the way you think. And I would go so far as to say that even the medium of what you use to write can drastically change the way ideas are linked together and connected together.
Yeah, it's not like a stenographer for your brain. It's more than that.
That's a much more succinct way to say it. Yeah, that's great. This idea started coming to my attention. I was reading a couple books on note-taking systems, and Zettelkasten is one of these ideas.
Zettelkasten. I said it's a percussion instrument.
So a Zettelkasten is not a percussion instrument. It is essentially a slip box or a system that you use to keep track of notes that you take. And this comes from German sociologist Niklas Luhmann. This was his system of capturing the notes that he took. He was ludicrously productive in his career as a sociologist. But his system was, he would read something, he'd write it down on an index card, and I guess the main difference between his system of note-taking and I think a more standard system of note-taking is that the notes were very atomic, and they were all linked together in a way that was cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. So you might read philosophy and sociology and physics and stuff, and the notes were kind of put in the same place. It wasn't like his filing system, like, here are all my notes on philosophy. Here are all
They
my
go
notes on
through the
education.
slit on the box, right?
And
so
they're just
if philosophy was green and neuroscience was purple, you'd have green, purple, yellow, blue, green, yellow, whatever. As he was thinking of things and writing things down, he was reading about or had ideas about, and he would just compile all those notes in one pile.
Exactly, and from what I know so far, his process for doing this went beyond just writing verbatim what was in a book. His process of writing the note was actually paraphrasing it and synthesizing it before it even hit the note. But kind of
putting it in your own words, so they belong to you at that point.
Yeah, and I'm sure there were literal quotes in there too. But kind of the benefit of this, and this is really why I wanted to bring this up, is that there is a difference between bottom-up thinking and top-down thinking, and academia is a really good way to contextualize this. But let's say you have to write a paper, like a master's thesis or a PhD, and we could even talk about your own PhD as just a case study of this. But a lot of the ways people go into this is you have a question, you have some kind of academic interest, and you have a question that's going to be the target of your research or your investigation, and then your research and your note taking is done kind of within the wheelhouse of figuring this question out. But the issue with this top-down approach to writing a paper or doing research is that it already assumes that you have done quite a bit of investigation and synthesis into the topic that you're investigating, because you wouldn't even be able to intelligently pose something that's worth being researched unless you had already been through a lot of that process. And I'm assuming that's why this is done in a master's degree and not necessarily in a bachelor in the second year, because you just don't have enough kind of ammunition you don't have enough understanding of the domain.
If you haven't read
intelligently,
if you haven't read broadly across many disciplines, that would help provide insight into why you even came up with the purpose for the paper. So the purpose is this large, if you imagine a funnel, it's the top of the funnel. And by the time you get down to your question, you're halfway through the funnel. And then everything after that is, planned and brought into existence by collecting data, analyzing it, and then coming up with conclusions on how you answered the question. So, and the question comes from all this other closely related research, but isn't including the question you're answering, unless it is a replication study, a study that you're following up to add more validity to an answered question by, I'm going to copy this exact cookbook, this recipe. I'm going to copy this recipe and see if I come up with the same, piece of cake. In other words, the same answer to the question that the previous researcher had. So there is replication studies, and those are really good. But if you're coming up with something entirely new, you want to make sure it hasn't been already done before, and you want to go through all the research that's related closely to that, like a parallel to language or parallel to music learning or other possibilities. Math learning could even be closely related research if they're manipulating the same variable, say, like early morning study, late afternoon study. Is that good for math? Better for English? I'm just making up an idea here. But in order to get to that point, you should have read, as much as you can possibly do of the gargantuan thinkers of, inside the, how do we make education better? That's a huge purpose. And then inside that purpose is how do we make music education better, teaching and learning, how do we do that? So that's a huge purpose.
Yeah. And this is what kind of interested me about this Zettelkasten idea, is that the right time to start synthesizing your ideas might not be when you're trying to write and actually do research itself. There might be a necessity to do that once you're writing a paper and trying to pin something down, but assuming you're interested in a field like music education, I mean, I'm reading all kinds of stuff all the time. There might, just in your daily reading of your interest of the subject, it might be useful to actually starting to take notes, and again, not just verbatim notes where you're copying paragraphs down and just filing them away, but where you're actually trying to paraphrase those things in your own words, and maybe just make sure you understand the punchline. That might be worth doing when you don't have a specific research project to actually carry out, because
for sure,
you need some kind of atomic pieces of knowledge to start using later on.
Yeah, wasn't it Feynman that you said that the writing of the idea is where the idea actually is given birth. Like, it's the writing of the idea down that,
exactly.
that he said brought it to life.
Yeah, and so the story around this is someone was talking to Feynman about his notebooks or his notes that he had written, and they said something like, "Oh, you do the thinking and you write the idea down." And Feynman was very opposed to that. He said something along the lines of, "No, the writing it down is when the thinking starts to actually happen." And that's a big. It can seem like a semantic distinction, but I think it is a big difference in the process of how you actually think, because we often have these like romantic ideas of like, I'm going to read a bunch of Edwin Gordon and a bunch of other stuff, and then I'll just go for an hour-long walk, and somehow, just in the privacy of my own mind, I'll figure all this out. And in my experience, that's not what happens. It starts getting sorted out when you have conversations with people, or you write things down. You need some kind of dialogue, whether it's with yourself in a notebook or with another human being, to actually start this kind of scaffolding of the idea. The idea is growing and taking shape. I think that's important to pick up on.
Yeah, writing things down helps you clarify your thinking, and thinking helps you clarify your writing. And those clarifications can come in editing your own work, or in having, this was what was so beneficial to me, having the most excellent advisor I could have ever found in terms of helping me write better. And I used to get papers back with red all through them, and at the end of one long paper, I said, I just wish I could do better, so, and he says, "Oh, you're one of the best I have," with all this red on it. It's like, I was already pretty good writer.
Important. But this is important because a lot of people have the idea when they're writing an article or paper or something that people try to do this thing where like the first rough draft is something that could just be a quick edit away from publishing. And I think this is just such a horrible mindset to be in, because it's trying to compile too many distinct processes. So, you're trying to basically just write the finished version in one go, instead of just having your topics that you need to cover and kind of just starting the process of thinking. Like, rough drafts aren't necessarily like your best attempt, and then someone who's wiser than you comes in and says, "No, this is horrible, you gotta fix this." It's actually the process of the thinking taking place, and that's such a different way to look at it, because if you look at it like that, the fifth rough draft that's been edited by your advisor, it's not an issue. It's like, oh, there's nothing actually wrong with me or my brain. But if you think about it as like, oh, well, there's so much red on here, it means I didn't do a good job of thinking through this, which is not necessarily true. I mean, because the idea might be really good, it just might need to be reworked in a way that's more consumable by someone who doesn't know anything about the topic.
And even before you start writing, all you have to do is mind dump, which is writing, but get your whatever is swimming in your head at the time, just put it down. Doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if you think it's not even closely related to your problem or purpose of the paper. You can just get things down on paper and then look at them.
I think this is actually like the point of brainstorming, is that you're supposed to have some kind of externalized map of the things you think are related. And then when you can take a step back from this and not use your own working memory to kind of hold everything, you can start to see connections between the ideas.
Yeah, you're overwhelmed with all the things that are going to go into your paper. You can't think of it all simultaneously. You can't probably even think of two ideas simultaneously. But for me, I was talking about when I pull out a CD I haven't played for forever, and I look at it, and I immediately remember the style and some of the tunes and the melodies and the timbres and everything that's in that CD. And sometimes it's like, I look at the CD and I'm like, yeah, I know I'm not in the mood for that right now. It's like you play, and so you can look at your note cards and just kind of feel, I remember what that is. So it's a existence system for your brain. So your brain doesn't have to work on it. You look at it and say, oh, I got it. It's like notation. If I looked at Fur-Elise, God forbid, right? Piano teachers are all squirming. If you look at Fur-Elise, and it's a reminder of everything that's in there. You don't have to. That's probably a bad example because that's already so internalized. But something that might not be.
I think that's a good example because that's what we do with sheet music. We know. I don't think a lot of people are literally reading it anymore as if you would when you initially decoded it or sight read it. You're kind of just like, oh yeah, it's this whole thing there.
Yeah. It's a quick way to remember everything you already cannaudiate. Mm-hmm. But so like the CD that I'm looking at and say, oh yeah, that's the perfect tune, or I know where I want to go on a CD, something I haven't played forever, but you still know it comes right back to you, and you can look at these notes as like little miniature linchpins for you to get a trail of thought that may not have happened before when you see these two these two note cards together, these two CDs together, or whatever.
I actually think this is what happened to me when I was reading Learning Sequences in Music and Theory of Instruction at the same time. I was actually writing down notes for those two things in one notebook, and they naturally kind of started leading with each other. It wasn't my attention. I wasn't sitting there thinking, like, how can I put Gordon's theory through Engelman and through Theory of Instruction? It was just kind of, the ideas were all kind of taking place at the same time, and some of them were very naturally cross-pollinating with each other.
Yeah.
And I really like that a lot because it's just such a cool way to come up with novel, rather research questions or topics to investigate. And you can probably even see like a bit of a history of this going on in my brain through the podcast.
Yeah, we'll get back to that.
So why don't we pin this down a bit with your experience? Like, do you want to tell us a bit about your own like master's thesis or PhD thesis, whichever one you want to talk about? But how did your own writing process go through? Because this might be useful for someone who wants to go back to school for a grad degree in music education. I know I sure want to. But what maybe choose one of those and walk us through like your initial conception of the research question and maybe how that changed and how you carried out the research and started synthesizing the ideas.
Yeah, because music, because young children, and the earlier in life the better, even prenatally, is such a sensitive and crucial period. So crucial, Dr. Gordon even talks about crucial and sensitive. Crucial being 0 to 2, sensitive being 2 to 5, maybe somewhere in there. They're, you could add and subtract a year or a few months or whatever. But I even thought that prenatally there's influences on the child's music aptitude, the child's musical self being or whatever. And what can I do to substantiate with a new way of looking at early childhood experiences to make them as important as we think they are?
So that was your PhD?
That was an idea, and I've been teaching early childhood for, by that point, over 10 years.
So this is like directly related to what I'm talking about. Like that idea was bubbling up for a long time. It wasn't like you just sit down. You didn't sit down with like Microsoft Word and you're like, what would be a good idea for like that?
No. I'd already had all of Dr. Gordon's classes, and I was privy to his first draft of his book, or the draft prior to getting it published. And he basically gave us his first book on in text, handed it out for music learning theory for newborn and young children. So that was the last class I had with him, and then I went back to all the daycares that I was teaching. And I watched all my kids and how some of them grew, how some of them didn't, how some were good tonally, some rhythmically, some whatever, expressively, all these different things. And so all while I was doing that, I was grappling with going back to get my PhD, but I was too scared to go back and get my PhD. I was really like, my master's thesis was a big accomplishment for me.
So it's interesting. So
because it was
workload.
It was with Gordon, and it was with,
yeah.
And there were so many peers around me that were, right, all the people, anybody you could mention on just about any book that came from Temple, I was a colleague with forever. Cindy, Butch, Eric, just Wendy, Beth Bolton, just name everybody that ever came out of Temple. So I was around that culture all the time. And so I was trying to hold myself to a super high standard, which is part of my makeup anyway. I always try to, do unrealistically well. And but at any rate, I spent about 2 years thinking about and writing everything I could down about how would I measure somebody's early childhood experiences. How do you quantify that? Well, I knew I was also going to qualify those experiences that parents had with their children before 2 years old. But I ended up with a survey, and it had an 88 a reliability coefficient of 88, which is really high. That means if I gave the survey out, that I could count on that it would that the scores were stable. So, and without that, you don't have validity. But it doesn't mean that you do have validity because it's reliable. So, at any point, and at any rate, I got to the point where I thought this instrument was going to get at almost everything I could get at. And it wasn't going to take too long. It wasn't, 10 pages. And I had to simplify the language and do everything I could so that I got good results from my parents. And then those are the parents of, kids that were 2 and 1 in the past, but now they're 5 and 6 and 7. So now I'm giving them a music aptitude measure. And I'm looking at how the scores on the test, the music aptitude test, and how the scores on my, and individual factors on my survey correlated.
So you're essentially, this is correlational, but you're trying to take in the direction to see if it's so correlational that it's basically plausible to just say there's a causal link.
Yeah, but how do you measure that kind of thing? How do you measure the parents' memory of what they actually did with their children? How many, there's like, how many hours a week did you sing to your children? Less than 1. 1 to 3. How many out did you go to church? Did you? And I wrote everything I could. How much, how much is music valued in your family on a, scale? How much is?
Did you have any parents who were music teachers? Because I'm thinking of Glenn Gould. Like his mom was a piano teacher, and prenatally, he's at the piano.
Yeah, but you know what? That would have been probably detrimental.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was a small group of music, of like moms specifically.
So what I did in the qualitative portion, when somebody had really high music aptitude, but said that their child had very poor music environment, I went and interviewed them. And the same thing with somebody who said that they did all this great music all the time and the kids scored low. And I like, okay, let me get to this. So I took the outliers and interviewed them and found out more. And I took some of the regular folks too, but I interviewed them, and in a qualitative practice, assembled all of their interviews, typed them up, and cut them out and ordered things and in piles of likeness, like church when they talked about church, or when they talked about, going to concerts, when they talked about, music being played live in the house, talked about music being played, on a stereo in the house. I took everything I could and then poked holes in the stories that they were telling me, or not. On the stories they were telling me.
It's funny you mention this, because I actually had to do this with my mom. Because growing up, music teachers would talk to my mom, and they'd be like, they weren't doing aptitude tests, but I was learning ridiculously fast compared to other people. And they'd ask my mom, like, oh, did he take lessons when he was younger? Are there any musicians in the family? And my mom would be like, no, there's nothing. Like, she just... But, when I talked to my mom, we sang at church, music was on all the time, the daycares had music on all the time. My stepdad never stops listening to music. It's literally just incessant in the house. Yeah. It's just like the repetitive movies with the music. Like, it's there if you hunt for it. It didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah. So I was working on what I thought was a really important problem. I think I really wanted to prove that we need to sing to our 2 and 1-year-olds more.
And then I just want to tie this, I want to tie everything that we've done so far to this topic of writing. Like, how, during this phase, like, this was quite a long phase, like, how much were you writing about the stuff that you were thinking about? Like, were you writing in notebooks or on computers, or like, what were you doing while this was bubbling up?
While I was doing the research, or prior, or after?
Yeah, both really.
I would do in fits and starts. I would blow out 5 or 6 pages, and then not, and then work on those 5 or 6 pages and not create anything new, just hone it. And then I would go to the schools and I would measure the kids, or I'd be mailing out these things, and I was over 4 or 5 years, and I'd worked 10 years prior. I was engaged in this huge process. And then I got this job at Peabody, and I moved down to Baltimore from Philadelphia. And then it sat for a whole year. And then I went back and I redid the whole qualitative portion a second time, because I lost the cards initially, but it was also really good. And I found the old set, of course. But I got to compare, and that was, I don't know how many hours of work that was, to go through all the conversations that were, dictated verbatim into a paper, and, cutting up all the students, sheets of different colors, and you go and you get a bigger picture of what you're after. And then you start to realize that maybe your survey is missing too much. And then while you're almost finished, you go, oh my God, my survey's invalid. You just kind of think through it enough, like, it's just, I'm measuring the wrong thing. Instead of measuring body mass, I'm just measuring weight. And the two don't correlate. or they correlate or they don't. Yeah, that just gives you, skewed data.
They correlate, except under specific circumstances that happen to be really important.
Yeah. So anyway, you're grappling with what is truth the whole time, and you don't want to, you want to maintain your integrity. And when you defend your dissertation, you get called on the carpet for anything that you're doing, and anything that you didn't do that you might have done, and all of that. And you've got to be able to understand the research process enough, and the worst thing is to think, well, I know and you don't, because I did the research. It's like, no, you realize how much we don't know, and you come out of that process, really more open to, or more humbled by the experience of, like, wow, I could spend another 30 years doing reading on this. And of course that doesn't, and here I am 40 years later after having met Dr. not quite 40, but still working on the same problem. or the same purpose. I'm driven by the purpose and in my life, and that's what makes teaching so fun for me. But that's a motivational aspect of it. So in the end, it's just realizing that the process of doing quantitative or qualitative research, just having conversations versus measuring with a ruler or something, how better to think about early childhood music development.
And so how often did you go through this process? I'm assuming a lot, but where you're talking to parents, you're getting the qualitative, getting qualitative and quantitative information from the parents, and from the kids with these aptitude tests. But then you would synthesize it into some kind of written form, like in your paper,
Mm-hmm.
and then maybe it would incubate in your own mind. Like, did you really feel that this process of having to do that was changing the way you thought about it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Like, versus just having done the qualitative and qualitative research, but not having synthesized it into a document.
Well, before you synthesize it, you just use the data and put it into computational, right? With qualitative, it's a whole different thing. Quantitative, it's all this work up front, and then you give the test, and then you then you get a statistician to help you understand how to better dissect the data, how to better manipulate the data, how to use formulas to get to the
signal.
the factors that contribute to early childhood learning, or the factors that contribute to the test scores. But then the qualitative is easy up front. You just write up a few questions, and then you go through those questions in the interview, and people answer, and then you gotta do all the data sifting and mining through all those conversations, hours and hours of conversations, and typing those up, noticing that there's similarities, noticing where there's differences, and putting them all together and trying to understand. And then you do that in 3 different, so you do that urban, and you do it suburban, and you do it rural. Right? And so you start to look at factors, socioeconomic or et cetera. And what you find is that it was too big a project to try to do in one fell swoop. But it gave me ideas for what I could do in the future, of course. So, and all through that, you're writing and then getting away from the writing, and then go back and writing again. And then I even had a year off before while I moved down here. I didn't think about my dissertation. That's where my nightmares started, which continue to this day, where I wake up and I haven't finished my dissertation.
Oh my god. Yeah, the taking the time off, I think, is really good, because you have this recency bias where if you read something you recently have read, you still have all these cues and ideas in your head that are making you understand what's on the written page more than necessarily someone else would, because you're bringing all this extra baggage you have, all these other ideas that are kind of below the surface here. If you take some time off, you get maybe a more kind of objective view of what someone else is experiencing when they read it. I think the same thing happens with editing music. You spend too much time mixing, you just go tone deaf to levels, and someone else listens to it and they're like, "Really? This is what you were thinking? This is 20 hours of mixing?"
Yeah, and then part of this was I wanted to write my dissertation to be as easy to read as possible, and to be thorough, obviously, but to have it be as short as I possibly could. And I got it down to like 105 pages, and then I kept trying to, how to find a way to get under 100. Just because I think it was, I forget who it was. I'm sorry. Was it Ben Franklin? I'm sorry. I, I'm sorry I've written such a long letter. Had I had time, it would have been much shorter.
Oh, yeah.
So, the concision. So I tried to make my dissertation as concise as possible. And simple and clear. All the things that are Darrel Walters. Write well now.
So I like this idea. I mean, this example of how someone goes through this with a really big academic piece of work, like a PhD thesis, is useful for people to hear about. But also, I think people can replicate this at a much smaller level without being committed to writing a huge article or paper with just your own thinking process. Like if you're reading learning sequences in music and you're struggling to comprehend it, it might be a good idea for you to just try, in a couple paragraphs, try to write down, like what is audio, like in just completely in your own words without relying on anything that you've heard from somebody else. And I think exercises like that go a long way to get things moving in the right direction. That's also why I think conversations are really important, and I think they can serve a very similar purpose. We often use this idea like writing as a tool for thinking, but I think conversations really serve a similar purpose, and there's no doubt in my mind that that's probably a huge part of why Eric and I even do this to begin with. So over the last couple of years, you can see how things start cross-pollinating, and how just the fact you have someone to report to and you have to say something half intelligible kind of forces you to make sure the ideas are somewhat being coherently exported from your mouth.
Yeah, and I've had lots of trouble with that through parts of the podcast here when I'm editing. It's sometimes awfully difficult to hear myself. I don't know if you'd have the same problem as I do with myself if you were doing the editing, or have the same problems you do with me.
I've had an issue with listening to myself. I've been like, oh, I should have just said it a different way.
I'm tired of me. I'm sorry, people. I'll work on it. I'm aware of it.
You really see the ums, the likes, the
The ums take over everything, So yeah, but speaking about it is part of it.
Possibly that's why writing works so well as a tool for thinking, is that it's a way to essentially have a dialogue with yourself without full-blown, unhinging your mind.
I never put a in my writing. It's fascinating. Yeah, it's good. So if people will take this idea, don't write a dissertation, or go to school and do that. It's if you love music education, there's no reason not to. So now I'm really noticing it. So, but use it as writing as a reflection tool for your teaching. Do it after school, maybe once a month, twice a week, whatever. But write things down and reflect on them, and then you'll have them for a couple of years. You can start to see themes of what you've written down. So you've had your attention on certain ways of doing things, or certain why you picked certain things to teach as opposed to others. Why are you not including extensions? This goes back to the last episode a little bit of the subjectivity of your content and how you sequence that. It'll just tone who you are, and you'll see gaps, and you'll see things that you're doing well, and hopefully you have somebody else who can also bounce things off with you, a mentor or colleague.
There's one more aspect I want to, because we've been looking at this through kind of a music education lens or an academic lens, but the the other lens I want to look at this through is actually composing music, because earlier I was talking about the Zettelkasten idea, and you have ideas, and I think the way a lot of people compose music is you just listen to a ton of music, you perform a lot of music, maybe a song has a cool chord in it you like, so you start improvising with that chord, and it slowly starts turning into something else, or there's this back and forth between consuming music, improvising, and composing. I always figure there's like a triangle between those three, but I've never actually purposely, practicing sight reading. I've never purposely like, hey, like that piece has a really interesting chord progression that's voiced in a certain way. Like, why don't I essentially take a note of this and put it somewhere and just make a point of like improvising with that. And I think one issue I see there being a difference between doing this with writing and improvising or composing music, but maybe not. It might be more of a parallel than I'm giving it credit for. Is that sometimes these musical ideas, like if you're seeing a new tonal pattern, or like, and when I mean tonal pattern, I'm being very charitable with that definition, like some crazy chord voicing with extensions, that might take like 6 to 24 months to like seep into your mind in a way where you can even coherently improvise with it. Like, we're not talking about like I took a note of a chord I saw in this piece and then next week I like put it in a song. Like, that very well might happen, but this might take months and years and I know Alan Holdsworth, like, the great guitar player, he said it took him about 2 years for something to sink into his audiation, where he was improvising with it on stage at the same level as things he's known his whole life. Like, that's the timeline he used to say, and he didn't use the word audiation, but you could tell like he's trying to say that.
Yeah.
And I like knowing that, because I think it brings the expectations a little, further down to earth, rather than I went to a concert and now I can play bebop like next week. Things might take a while to percolate like in your mind.
Yeah, so when I compose, so my audience is little kids. So I just pick a tonality meter style, and then I boxed myself in, and then I've got to get out of that box. But the thing is, I don't use anything out of the box that isn't already deep inside me. There's nothing when I'm composing that isn't already, I know this is going to make sense. Now, when the end of the day comes and I get 12, 15 songs sometimes in a day. If they're, 16 bar ditties or just a rhythm chant that a rhythm got into your head, you just put down and then you add some words to it. Sometimes I'll go back and adjust the lyrics and things like that. But I don't, I think out of that batch, I might have 2 hits, or 1, or 0, and the rest of it are serviceable, and then I try them out in class, and I see which ones
I think there's
work.
a parallel here between improvising and when you're writing for like an academic paper, like you were saying before. You almost need to just do like a brain dump before you can even start assembling the ideas into things that are worth keeping and not keeping. And I almost think of improv like that. It's like, okay, I'll just choose a tonality generally in a meter, and let's just improvise for a while. And if something cool comes up, like maybe that's worth noting down.
So, I heard a Chick-fil-A commercial or something, and I said, Chick-fil-A creme brulee, am I going to have some today while I wear a toupee? Or should I have souffle in the month of May on a Saturday? I think me cray-cray. No way. How do I pay? Yesterday, far away. Right? And it just started writing anything with a one horse open sleigh, whatever. Right? That one's not down on that list, but it's just plays on word, or plays on words.
So this is cool, because this is exactly what I'm talking about. You have this list, and you can use this list as a scaffold to kind of like rap with, essentially. And I think that's what Eminem.
It's just it's just the content of some language that I could put together in a funny way.
But I think you can do a very similar thing when you're composing, especially if you're trying to use ingredients, like rhythm patterns and tonal patterns and chord progressions. You could actually just make like if you have a whiteboard or just on a computer, where you have a bit of a mind map of like, these things are cool, and you can kind of just look at that and try to improvise a bit. I think sometimes we I think sometimes we act like creativity has to just exist within the vacuum of your mind, or it's not like air quote authentic creativity. I mean, that's what instruments are for, is they help you externalize your thinking auditionally, especially the piano. I mean, like I I can audiate harmony well now, and I can just sit there and audiate harmony and picture it, but I'd rather sit with a guitar or piano because it extends that ability, and especially it allows me to kind of try things and hear what they would sound like before I can audiate them too.
Yeah, manipulated some added tones that you might not consider, but you just randomly pick an extra note. It's not random, but thoughtful.
And you can do this with You can do this with notation software too. But the problem with notation software is that it's so slow. Like if I'm sitting at a piano, I can just say ding. I can add those notes to the voicing. But on a notation software, I have to reach over and like pencil the notes in and then press play, and it has the extra advantage when you just play the instrument. You can actually play what you're experimenting, like you're practicing it at the same time.
Yeah, I got to the point writing some of my tunes that I could audiate with my fingers, inputting notation on finale. Like I could sing, but you got to sing really slow. But if you're singing it and playing it, and then entering, you got to use the numbers on the keypad for half note, quarter note, right? And then dots and stuff. Dots mess me up because they take the same length as the note to enter.
I mean, it's a really cool. There's a bunch of ways you can go around this, but it's a really cool experience. Like, get staff paper that's where the lines are quite small. Get a very inky pen, like a fountain pen, and just sing and see if you can actually just create dots for the note heads, and don't write any rhythm. Just boom, 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 ba da da da, and just compose while you sing. And that's a really cool way to get an improvised melody down. There might be a disconnect in your brain, like the ability to actually write down what you're.
But I have all kinds of scrap staff paper around with ideas. In fact, I have one of my best songs ever. It's gone missing. It's here, but I haven't needed to find it again. But it's a tune that I wrote that it makes me cry, and so I don't spend a lot of time. Anyway, I continually edit it harmonically because my harmonic vocabulary grows. And this is what I'd rather have than what I've had in the past as the harmonic functions for this melody. But I have so many songs just floating around here. Once I put them all together and go into that, that train of thinking.
And that's why I think I brought this up before, but there in writing there are separate processes. So there's the act of collecting ideas that interest you, and that's just done through reading and music, listening to music, and going to concerts and sight reading and practicing songs. But then there's a stage where, like, when you're actually writing, I feel like there's a big separation between improvising sections versus editing. It's the same separation that you get in writing a more academic style paper. Yeah. It's not a good idea to do the editing too early, because it chokes off the improvising in a sense. Where if you're trying to make something sound like album finished while you're improvising, you're basically judging while you're improvising, and it's just the worst thing to do because it just chokes off the flow of ideas.
On the other hand, there's something very interesting that's happened to me on a few different occasions, but it's more of a miracle, and the bigger miracles that I remember, that they stick. So I did improvise in my class, and a lot of my chants or simple songs came out of the kids or me or a combination, and they just stuck. And sometimes they came out in their finished form the very first time.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really good example of where, when you have musical vocabulary and musical ideas like tonal patterns, rhythm patterns, things that you have mastered, it's much more appropriate to just kind of on the spot create something that sounds finished, because it's similar to a conversation in a sense where if I know what I want to say, and I have the right ideas for what I want to say, and I have the vocabulary and the grammatical skill to execute it, it comes out. And so that makes total sense to me. I sent my friend a song a couple of weeks ago. It was just, I sent it to you as well. It was just like, hit record one take, and it was cool. But he was like, "This is great. Like, I would kill to write something like this." And then I just texted, and I was like, "One take."
Yeah.
But I mean, to me, it wasn't that great because it was like chord voicings that I already knew, and like it was things that had already really well.
Be open to that. Be open to that. That comes out of having done that a lot, having been creative a lot, and then improvising a lot makes your creativity easier. Creativity makes your improvising easier. Don't what I'm saying. I think I want to say is allow the miracles to happen. Try not to, if you stay out of the judgment zone, like you're saying. But it's also the other way around. The more you hone it, the more you work on something. I bring home these ideas, and some of them, really need to change. But some of them are so perfect right off the bat that it's silly.
Exactly.
And
there's an issue with the subjectivity here too, because when I play something that's easy for me and I can audiate it well, it just has this like ring of simplicity in my mind. And if you're kind of chasing, more and more fancier voicings or more adventurous something, rhythm, harmony, form, then you can kind of fall into this pattern where anything that's easy for you to just lay down is not almost like worthy of. A really good example of this is like John Mayer on one of his albums. They were talking about like what should be the single, and he made a choice, and his producer just chose another song, kind of screwed him on it. But that song won him a Grammy, and the reason he didn't think that the song that the producer chose was like the hit was because it was just so easy for him to write.
Yeah.
He was like, "There's nothing." He's like, "This is a cool like 7th or 8th track on the album. Yeah. Like it's not leading the pack or anything." Because he's probably more interested in the things that are like challenging him, pushing him.
Well, things that are tickling his audiation bone. So.
Yeah. I always found that kind of case study interesting. It's funny you mentioned it.
Yeah, I just tried the stuff out in the classrooms, and the kids that respond to it, if they don't, then I might try it a few other places or whatever. But some of it just comes out of thin air, and it's just silly.
Yeah.
Somebody said chicken and flies, and I said chicken and flies, and we just got done doing chicken and froggy, right? So they said flies, and so here we go. Chicken and flies, chicken and flies, chicken and flies makes me cry. Chicken and flies, chicken and flies, chicken and flies makes me cry. So, and then it was grape juice and ties, grape juice and eyes. No, grape juice and ties, grapefruit and eyes. We just came up with a whole bunch of, and it's just silly, and it's just. That was it. It was done. It was done. The kids said that, and that came out, and that was the end of it.
That's great.
And it's simple, obviously, but it's 5/8, so I needed a reason to do it, and there just weren't enough 5/8 tunes in my library at that time. And and then they learned the functions, and in 5 minutes we were done with the song. We created it, wrote it, learned the functions, moved to it, and went on. They're my more advanced kids. We were getting ready for more creativity and improvisation in that class.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, one of the
and that's caught on.
Listened...
It's stupid, but it's caught on.
That song caught on, yeah. I mean, that's a good way to get feedback too. Is it, if you play something and people just, there's something in it that hooks in people's minds, turns into an earworm or something like that. Then maybe it's good to keep around.
Yeah, kids are the best feedback because they don't lie. Because they don't have anything at stake. So anyway, that's a good.
Oh yeah.
All right.
One of the reasons I wanted to bring this up with composing is because I think there's such a use in improvising while you're learning a piece. So like, you're learning some classical piece or whatever it is, and there's a voicing that's hard for you to play or whatever. Instead of just repetitively playing the chord or the melody over and over again for that piece, which is fine. That's what you're doing. You're practicing the piece. Using that and improvising a bit while you're practicing, and you kind of, you kill a couple birds with one stone here. You learn the voicing in the context of this song, you remove it from the context of that song, and you start to compose with it. But it's funny because this way that Nicholas Luhmann ran his Zettelkasten kind of idea note factory, it reminds me a lot of how Paul Harris recommends practicing, where you learn a piece and you look at all the ingredients that go in the piece, whether it's the tonal patterns or rhythm patterns or whatever, and you play around with them in a sense, and it feels a lot more natural to practice like that rather than make a regimented, like, I have to play section A 10 times perfectly in a row, like when there might not even be a really good reason to do that. But it kind of it links up the digestion of another composer's ideas with your own composing. It doesn't separate the processes in time by like a month or an hour or whatever it is.
Niklos, huh? Was he a saint?
I do not believe so.
There was a Saint Niklos, and then he became Santa Claus here.
I think it's Niklas.
Niklas. So German, but not Niklos. That's where Santa Claus came from. Santa Claus is Saint Nicholas. Nicholas. Yeah. So on that note, a piece of trivia.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens over the next few months. If all of a sudden I'm composing so much that Eric's literally afraid, we'll all know that Zettelkasten music works.
That's what we'll title this. Zettelkasten.
We kind of have to write off anything that happens in the next 2 to 6 weeks because there could be so much novelty to it. It's just like making me focus abnormally well. So I mean, we'll have to see what happens in like 3 months.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, that's fun.